All right, so we are on to chapter 26. This is the Affluent Society. So what this chapter is doing is it's going to cover the same time period, more or less, that we talked about last week, but it's just going to be focusing on social issues and domestic issues, whereas last week talked more about foreign policy and things like that. So this is the Affluent. All right, so affluent society, what does that mean? Where does that term come from? Well, it comes from 1958. There was a Harvard economist by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith, and he wrote a book called The Affluent Society. And what he did in the book is that he examined post-World War II consumer economy and political culture. And it was a criticism. He's criticizing what he sees as an economy dedicated to consumption and production, which he predicted was going to lead to economic inequality. But it does describe pretty accurately, I mean, his criticism aside, you can make of that what you will and come to your own conclusion. It does accurately describe the fact that the economy is focused on mass consumption, similar to what we saw in the 1920s. And there was a lot of growth economically. The American economy witnessed massive growth at this time period. This was largely due to Cold War defense spending. And also another big reason is pent-up consumer demand for lots of things: cars, suburban homes. If you think about what preceded this time period, we've got World War II, and then before that you had the Great Depression, in which in the past 20 years people really haven't been able to purchase these kinds of things. They haven't had the means, and now all of a sudden they do. And so you're going to see this unleashing of all this pent-up desire to buy stuff. It does lift millions into the middle class. However, it's going to reproduce existing inequalities. Women in particular are going to struggle to claim equal rights despite having served in many war industries on the home front. And poorer people are going to struggle to win access to good schools, healthcare, and jobs, which is not something that we really have addressed. It's an ongoing issue to this day. Suburbs are going to give the middle class new space, new living space, and because the people who have means are moving out to the suburbs, cities are left to fall victim to poverty and crime. And we also see continued segregation. So it's a time period of a lot of contradictions. There's prosperity for some, there's poverty for others, there's new opportunities for some, there's continuing discrimination for others, there is a liberating lifestyle for some, but there's a return to conformity for others. So it goes on with what we've talked about before. You can't make a lot of broad generalizations about certain time periods by saying, oh, that was good. Everybody had it well. Everyone was doing well at this time. This was when we had it all figured out, because that might have been true for some people, but not for all. It's too simplistic of a way of looking at things. So the first domestic change we're going to be looking at is the growth of suburbs, what we call suburbanization. So there's going to be a huge demand for new homes. That is the result of this robust economic growth. People have the means and they want to buy larger living spaces for themselves. A man by the name of William Levitt is going to apply the assembly line, the production process that made the Model T, the car for the average man, is going to make the home for the average man as well. So we have these affordable, mass-produced homes. There are 13 million new homes built in 1950 alone, and 11 million of those are in suburbs. So not only is there a desire for more living space, but the GI Bill allows veterans to buy homes with little to no down payment and modest monthly payments stretched out over 20 to 30 years. Additionally, the Federal Highway Act of 1956 called for $25 billion to pay for 40,000 miles of 4-lane interstate highways. So what that means is that people can very easily work in the cities but live in the suburbs. So all of this, a thriving economy, a good income for many, provides this new sense of faith in the future. And the result of that is going to be what we call the baby boom. Additionally, Americans are going to be marrying at a younger and younger age. Typically, when you think of, the age in which people marry and settle down to have kids, you tend to think of that as going up over time. And it actually went backwards in this time period. In 1956, the average age of marriage for men was 22 and just 20 for women. And again, this results in this boom of babies being born. There are 76 million babies born between 1946 and 1964. And this generation, of course, as referred to kind of derisively as boomers by people who are like me, millennials, or Gen Z, like most of you are. And so if you know anybody born between this time period, they are the boomer generation. So by 1960, for women, 3/4 of all women between the ages of 20 and 24 are now married. So if you think about what is life going to be like for them? What have we talked about so far? Well, we've talked about the fact that people are buying homes out in the suburbs. They are bigger than what you might see in a generation before. They're having more children at a younger age, and so this is resulting in a return to traditional gender roles in which men are the breadwinners and women are housewives. Because again, a bigger house, more kids, it doesn't leave a whole lot of time for any kind of career. And if you think about it, if women are, the expectation is you're going to get married between 20 and 24, it doesn't leave a whole lot of time for college and career establishment. And this was reinforced by the media. If you think about some of the famous television shows of this era, especially something like Leave It to Beaver, where the mother, June Cleaver, is the ideal middle-class housewife. She's completely dedicated to her family. She's pretty often depicted, as you can see there, cooking, all dolled up with her pearls or vacuuming with heels on. That she's dedicated to, her looks and her family. And Life magazine published a feature on what they called this ideal suburban housewife, who again is dedicated to their husbands and their children, attending the PTA and not really seeking any kind of employment outside of the home. A new sense of affluence for white middle class families at this time is going to promote consumerism. Shopping at shopping centers is going to become a recreational activity, and that's changed a lot lately, and probably the past, I would say 10 to 15 years, with online shopping, particularly Amazon, making it so easy to just, buy something online. But I think about like my generation growing up, and going to the mall was a recreational activity. It was something that you did with your friends on like a Saturday, and you would just go to kind of hang out there and buy a couple things. And that becomes the case starting in the 1950s. And again, it's really changing now. Television is driving a sense of consumerism as well. Not only are people buying television, but television is advertising other things for people, encouraging people to go out and buy other things. By 1953, half of all households are going to have a TV, and that's only going to go up from there. So much so that the TV is going to become the center of the family. Again, that's changing the past 10 and 15 years. You can pretty much stream any show, anytime, anywhere if you have a smartphone or some other device. So, you're kind of your own little island. But if you think about prior to that, everybody would gather around the TV after dinner or whatnot, and it becomes the centerpiece of the house. So thinking about all these things, ask yourself, why do you think the 1950s produces such nostalgia for Americans? This tends to be the time period that people look back on and say, like, oh yeah, we had it all figured out in the 1950s. So think, why do you think that is? And maybe what's missing from that analysis of this time period? Not everybody agreed with this new kind of lifestyle. The suburban lifestyle was not universally liked. Many people were critical of it. They denounced the suburbs as quote-unquote box houses. They felt it was a lifestyle that was very superficial. It was producing a generation of spoiled children. And novelists also criticized this lifestyle. Novels from the time, such as Sloane Wilson's The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which depicts a young couple struggling with the conformity of everyone around them. And so here's a quote from that book. All I could see was a lot of bright young men in gray flannel suits rushing around New York in a frantic parade to nowhere. And the end of the story kind of shows that he is critical of it, but yet finds himself a part of this conformity. There's also a lot of criticism of large corporations where many suburbanites are working. William H. White was a sociologist who wrote The Organized Man, in which he said the emphasis on the team, quote unquote, and these large organizations stifled identity, and because of that, restricted growth and risk. Another Harvard sociologist by the name of Daniel Reisman also studied conformity in large corporations, producing his work, The Lonely Crowd, in which he said that employees valued getting along over taking risks. So again, conformity, trying to be more like everybody else versus trying to take a risk. Most of the people who had a problem with this conformity were known as the Beat Generation. They rejected middle America's consumption and conformity. Beats could mainly be found in places like San Francisco and New York City's Greenwich Village. They went to bookshops, they listened to jazz, they discussed, Asian philosophies such as Buddhism, and they avoided, as they called it, the square world, square being, people who conformed. And the best known Beat author of this time would be, of course, Jack Kerouac. If you've ever read On the Road, it is definitely it is indicative of this whole generation of people, young people mainly, who rejected the conformity of the average. There is a rejection of this in art as well. Edward Hopper, who painted in the realistic tradition, that's his probably most famous painting there, coincidentally, at the Art Institute of Chicago on the top. And it depicts the loneliness and alienation of American life. If you've done any kind of study of this painting, no doubt somebody has pointed out that the figures all seem to be isolated from one another. And so that's, again, supposed to be a reflection of the isolation that people feel as they conform to this suburban lifestyle. Jackson Pollock is famous for not portraying any specific subject matter. That's his painting on the bottom. It's in a style known as abstract expressionism, and it's created by spontaneously dripping oil on canvas that's spread across the floor. So very clearly a rejection of any kind of tradition or conformity. So there's few Americans who are reading Beat Generation poems or looking at abstract expressionism paintings. So it's really appealing to very few people. But what most people are doing is listening to music. And the popular music of the 1950s is pretty emotionless, cute, and bland. It's very peppy, kind of bubblegum pop. But all that is going to change going through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And it's going to start off mainly with black musicians who are going to combine gospel, blues, and jazz into a genre known as rhythm and blues. So as was the case with jazz music, young whites start listening to rhythm and blues, and they start producing their own version of rhythm and blues, which a Cleveland disc jockey by the name of Alan Freed names rock and roll. So in the spring of 1953, probably the most famous of this generation of rock and roll musicians, Elvis is going to record his first album, and it becomes the music of teenagers. And the music challenges accepted beliefs about sex, race, and work in the way that future genres are going to do for teenagers of future generations. Think about rap music or grunge music or emo music. Any kind of going forward, any kind of music is going to be kind of a rejection of the music before it. So while many middle and working class white families start on a trend of upward mobility with homes in the suburbs, with the help of FHS loans and the GI Bill, many minorities find themselves shut out of this mobility. So where does that come from? So we have to talk about some programs that got started prior to this time period, and then how do they tie into it? We'll get into that. So the first that we're going to look into is the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So this is a New Deal program. So again, going back to the 1930s, the Great Depression. And what it does is it purchases and refinances mortgages that are at risk of default. So again, these would be mortgages that, for whatever reason, they're at risk of people not paying them. That's what default means. So the idea is to pay back the interest and the principal on the loan regularly for 15 years. And this is going to enable home ownership to be open for more people. Another New Deal organization involved here is the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. So the FHA insures mortgages and protects lenders from loss. So it encourages lenders to loan more because they don't have to worry as much about people defaulting on their loans. Lenders are able to offer low rates and terms for 20 to 30 years, which is what most people nowadays would have on their mortgage as well. And it allows more people to afford homes. Okay, so where does that come into play with segregation? Well, the policies are going to produce segregated housing markets. So again, how does this work? The homeowners loan corporation is going to use appraisal techniques by which they are going to label heavily minority neighborhoods as quote unquote credit risks. And they're going to produce these maps that you can see over there on the right, these residential security maps, in which they are going to identify high and low risk lending areas. So how do they determine if an area was a high or low risk lending area? Well, they would send out these surveys to people who were familiar with the areas and have them fill out the surveys and send them back in. And they would analyze this information, and then they would assign different neighborhoods a letter code with the letters from A to D. And those letters would have a corresponding color. So D, the corresponding color was red, and these indicate the least secure areas. And they were often limited. Loans were limited in these quote unquote red line areas. They were deemed to have quote unquote subversive racial elements and racial hazards in those areas. And so lenders weren't willing to give people loans. So this brings into a question of de jure versus de facto segregation. So de jure is segregation by law. We've seen this when we've talked about, and we will continue to talk about, Jim Crow laws in the South. It's a law that literally says, something like, if you're black, you have to use this water fountain. If you're white, you use this water fountain. It is a law segregating races. De facto is nobody says this is how it is, but everybody knows this is how it is. So, a neighborhood, for instance, nobody might say that this particular town or neighborhood is where minorities live and this particular town or neighborhood is where white people live. It is the way it is. And so trying to get rid of de jure segregation is a lot easier than trying to get rid of de facto segregation. Because again, there's no law you can overturn. If this is just nobody's telling people this is how it is, it's just how it is, it's a whole lot more difficult to address. So going back in time, talking about de jure segregation, in 1896, recall that the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the separate but equal clause. But we know that practically segregated schools and other segregated parts of society were rarely equal. So looking particularly, this is especially true for black schools in the South. They had fewer funds, inadequate facilities, and substandard materials. So for example, the South spent on average $165 per white student and $115 per black student. So the NAACP, which was established in 1909, is going to begin a strategy of filing legal cases to challenge laws and to try to gain justice and civil rights. And they did this since their founding. This was something that they tried again and again, hoping that one of these cases was going to get taken up by the Supreme Court and seen through. So this is going to have some success on public schooling, at least, when Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP legal team is going to put out 5 test cases to challenge school segregation, and one of them is going to work. So Oliver Brown, a man from Topeka, Kansas, filed on behalf of his daughter Linda, who had to walk 25 blocks to the black school when the local white school was just around the corner from her house. Thurgood Marshall argued that segregated schools in America were unconstitutional and that they denied black children equal protection of the laws, which was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. And again, they had success. Chief Justice Earl Warren and the Supreme Court unanimously agreed, and they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson with the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education. And this is what the majority opinion of the Supreme Court had to say on the matter. We conclude that in the field of public education that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So with this ruling, the Supreme Court orders the states to begin desegregating the schools, but the South opposes this. The most famous case in which there was intense opposition to this required desegregation happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. There was a plan to have 9 black students integrate the white school, Central High School. On September 3rd, 1957, 1,000 people gathered to attack these students and anyone who showed any kind of sympathy with them. There were 150 police officers called, but they failed to protect the students, and so Eisenhower had to send in 1,100 paratroopers to protect the students as they made their way to class every day. And Eisenhower had said this about his decision to send in troops to protect the students, the Little Rock Nine as they became known. The very basis of our individual rights and freedoms rests upon the certainty that the President and the executive branch of government will support and ensure the carrying out of the decisions of the federal courts, even when necessary, with all the measures at the President's command. So that brings to our second chapter question: what effect does de facto segregation have on education today? Maybe think about things that you've seen personally, your own personal experience, or things that you've heard from friends or classmates that you've met, and think about what effect, again, that you can see continuing on to. So now we're getting into, the quote-unquote the civil rights movement. Though again, I reiterate, this has been an ongoing movement since the abolition movement tried to and eventually successfully brought about the end of the end of slavery. But the quote-unquote civil rights movement famously begins on December 1st, 1955, when 42-year-old seamstress Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on the Montgomery City bus line. The police arrested her and fined her $10 for her actions. This kicks off the Montgomery bus boycott, in which a 26-year-old minister by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King is thrust forward as the leader of the boycott, and they are successful. 15 months later, the Supreme Court rules that bus segregation is also unconstitutional. So this boycott makes national news, and it makes Dr. King very influential, and he had a specific method for challenging unjust laws. It's called nonviolent civil disobedience, and his take on it derived from the writings of Henry David Thoreau and the actions of Mahatma Gandhi in India. And he forms the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but there are going to be other organizations that are going to come about to try to end segregation in America, and there's going to be other leaders who are going to have a different take on the proper way forward than Dr. King. So going along in the theme of civil disobedience, by 1960, lunch counters, which you can see over there to the right, were still segregated in the South. And so this, again, this movement of nonviolent disobedience inspires 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, to go and to sit in the whites-only section of the Woolworth's lunch counter. And it's a sit-in, so they do just that. They're not violent, they're not, calling people names. They just go and they just sit and they just wait with the expectation that they're eventually going to get served, knowing that that's not going to happen. And because of their actions, 6 months later, the Greensboro Woolworth is desegregated. And this energizes other young activists to do the same. So black and white students together form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and they stage all sorts of versions of a sit-in. Read-ins, watch-ins, swim-ins. I mean, it's the same kind of concept, just applied to different places. And again, you're not breaking the law, you're not causing, a fight or anything. You're just going and you're knowingly breaking this segregation, but you're doing it in a nonviolent way. All right, so that is the end of that chapter. It's a very short one. One of these chapters is going to have to be combined to get us back on track because we're short a week, and I wanted to make it this one because it's so short, but in light of the fact that I moved the due date for your essays to Wednesday, I didn't want to overwhelm people, so it's not going to be this week, but do bear that in mind that coming up there's going to be a week in which we have to do 2 chapters, again, just to cover and make up for that that missed week, so keep your eye out for an announcement on that.